What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with an emergency podcast that might be attached to another podcast, except not on YouTube. Speaking of which, before we dive into the Detroit Pistons and the impact of the Cade Cunningham injury, just want to remind you, beg you, implore you, plead with you, subscribe to us wherever you're watching us. If you're on YouTube, checking us out for the first time, hit that sub button, like and comment, help the algorithm love us back. We put out a lot of content on YouTube, and so you want to definitely sub there, but also subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play to help us continue grow the actual podcast, which is the meat and potatoes of this operation. And cross subscribe. Definitely have us subscribe to an audio podcast player as well as being subscribed on YouTube. If you've done both of those things, please consider telling people about this podcast. Recommend us to friends, family members, acquaintances, coworkers, random people on the street, enemies even, who you think like basketball and are looking for a good NBA podcast. We are thoroughly and seriously unserious, but also thorough in general. Have a lot of fun around these parts. Join our Discord as well, where there's always great discussions happening, and you get mailbag priorities. We very rarely have to venture out Discord for mailbag questions now, and we never really have to. We only do so just, I want to give all the listeners a chance to ask questions. Maybe some people don't have Discord, but head over there. Link is in the podcast and YouTube description. And finally, follow us on all our socials. We're at HardwoodKnocks on Twitter and TikTok, and at Hardwood_Knocks on Instagram. And I'd appreciate if you give all those accounts follows as well. With that out of the way, we get to some pretty shitty news. Cade Cunningham is going to miss the rest of the season after deciding to undergo left shin surgery. This felt like it was kind of inevitable, even though the decision took a little while to get there. This immediately puts Detroit in the Wembanyama sweepstakes, even though that they were already in there. When you look at the standings, they will probably finish without, look, people quibble about the value of Cade's game, but like now that Cade Cunningham is just not a part of it, the Pistons have the worst record in the league right now. I will be semi-shocked if they wind up not having one of the bottom three records and one of the top three odds at getting Victor Wembanyama. They might have always been there with Cade or close to it. And so I don't really think this materially impacts their draft position at all. I do think it materially impacts the rest of this season and the roster as a whole. And so I wanted to touch on a few important points. The first of which is I hope Cade Cunningham makes a full recovery and will be fine. The fact that his game is not prided on all this above the rim explosion, shin injuries can be fickle, especially when you're undergoing surgery on them. I think that it will just end up, we shouldn't see any, maybe it takes him a little while to get back into the swing of things next year after missing so much time. But this is not something that I view as like damning to him moving forward. I also think that he got to a point where he was underrated because people started to harp too much on like the efficiency or the waxing and waning of it all. He elevated the play of those around him, especially when you gave him spacing to work with. I'm a little bit disappointed, and we'll touch on one of the points that I'm going to get into, that we're not going to get to see him more with the Isaiah Stewart, Jalen Duren front court, which the Pistons are finally starting. I think that made just so much sense when you surrounded them with Bojan Bogdanovic being there. And then you probably want to round that out with Jaden Ivey to get more information long-term, but you can sort of like, if Sadiq Bey is a part of that with Cade, maybe even try out Killian Hayes there or Isaiah Livers, like to round out that fifth spot, not necessarily as a starter, but just in general. That would have been fun to see because it's a very small sample size. I think Cade has played like sub 20 possessions or something ridiculous with Isaiah Stewart and Jalen Duren together. And that's just something that I would have wanted more information on. Now for the Pistons moving forward, and we'll get to that in a second. This is big in the sense that they can at least get more information on Jaden Ivey as sort of more of a point guard or playing independent of Cade. I don't actually love that because I want those two to work together. And I think that the fit is far from clean. They don't overlap, so they're not redundant. They could theoretically complement one another, but the fit is tricky unless Jaden Ivey is going to get better as a cutter or trust him more as a shooter. And look, to be honest, watching him without Cade, sub 40% on drives, his shot selection and turnover issues have been ghastly at points. It feels like it might be aggravating some of his teammates too when you watch their body language on certain half-court possessions. He's young. He's a rookie. He could still be really good. The fact that you're going to get more of a sample size with him maybe running the show than you would have with Cade, there will be value in that. I wanted to see the balance struck more between him and Cade, and I was looking forward to watching that unfold more of the season. But the benefit of this is we get to see sort of more of Killian Hayes. And so as a starter, yes, it's you're not going to see him start when Cade is healthy, but to scale it forward as someone who could come off the bench and can you trust him? Look, he's shooting over 40% on above the break threes since Cade Cunningham's injury. The finishing is bad. He's at in the restricted area. He's at 47.5% since the Cade injury. He still can like get to his floater and like take that shot. That's still something you like the floater. Yes, that's a weapon, but like he's not the most efficient mid-range shooter overall outside of that. And if he's not getting to the basket or finishing well there, he's also not getting to the foul line a ton. So that's stuff you still want to see him work on. But I think you look at the rest of his game and you have to be encouraged. He's shooting 4 of 6 on step back jumpers during this time. Like I said, the 3-point shooting has ticked up this year. And I think you can buy into it because he's hitting some assisted looks too. It's not just like you need to have him work off the dribble and then he's hitting all these shots that are theoretically over his head. The shooting improvement from beyond the arc feels like it could be real. Would I predict it? No, not necessarily. But I think what's also really important is now you're looking at a player who, if he has that weapon in him and you can at least, let's say you trust his floater and you trust his outside three, now you get to a player where you almost have to play him overall because his defensive value is for this Pistons team specifically, probably through the roof. And I think he's probably with Cade out, but he might even have a case as like their best passer overall. I would still pick Cade, but like he's no worse than their second most important playmaker right now. And you can see it when he really gets going inside the arc. Defenses still react. They're still going to go in rotation. He knows how to make plays off of his drives, not turning the ball over a ton on those plays either, And I was looking this up before after going back and watching some of the Killian Hayes film. I'm going to go to my phone to just double check it that I had the number right here. But when you look at his turnover rate on drives, it's sub 5% since the Cade Cunningham injury, and his assist rate is at 14. So like that's really high. And just how high is these are the only players who have that same assist rate and sub 5 turnover rate while using as many drives during the span. Jimmy Butler, Karis LeVert, and Jamal Murray. That's it. And so like Tyrese Halliburton's right there as well. And so is Devin Booker. So that's really good company to be in. I'm not saying that Killian Hayes is any of those players, though he might be like, closer to he's not any of those players. Like he's more of a below the rim player than some of those guys, specifically if you're looking at Jamal Murray, although post injury Jamal Murray, maybe not. Being able to control the ball in the half court like that, again, still not a threat to go to the free throw line. He just doesn't get fouled on his drives, doesn't get there. To have someone who can sort of manage the game, though, and set up others, I think that's big. And to get more information with him going up against better competition, I think that helps you moving forward because you do have sort of this, it's not a logjam, but this 3-guard or 3 ball handler dynamic in Cade, in Killian, and Jaden Ivey. And you want to see how you can work well with it. Now we're getting information on Jaden Ivey and Killian Hayes as a pairing, but also just like if Killian Hayes is going to kill it as a starter or in just a more prominent role without Cade, like that, in theory, makes it easier and more promising to bring him off the bench, even if you view him as a long-term 6th man, which I think is the most likely outcome. We don't have to say that Killian Hayes is going to be a star or that his ceiling is all of a sudden higher than Jaden Ivey's. We don't have the sample size necessarily for that, but I think what we've seen from him in Cade's absence has been really encouraging. Also encouraging, and I'm a little bit, I don't know if I'm surprised, but I'm just happy that Dwayne Casey went to it already, is seeing Beef Stew and Jalen Duren play together more. That's a unit where, especially when you look at how bad Detroit has been on the glass this year, bottom 5 defensive rebounding team, roughly close to it per cleaning the glass. When those two play together, they're in like the 95th percentile of defensive rebounding. And I think they just complement one another really well. Isaiah Stewart has been shooting like 39% on above the break threes since Cade Cunningham's injury. And he's also, James Edwards III wrote a great piece about this at The Athletic. We've also seen like Beef Stew make more complicated decisions when defenders actually choose to close out on him, which again, it isn't often. I think we saw it some against the Knicks game and in the Heat game a little bit. And there are some there are some defenses that seem to be reacting to him and paying him more respect. He's shooting, by the way, I think it's from the right or left corner. I think it might be the left corner. Beef Stew's at 55+% from 3 since the Cade injury when I was looking up those numbers. But he's able to put the ball on the deck, and like when defenders are closing out at him, like he can dump it off to the next player. I don't know that I trust him yet as like a finisher in those plays. He's definitely not shooting well in those situations, and he's since the Cade injury, he's shooting like 37.5% or something in the restricted area, so that's not great. But to have him being able to space the floor with Jalen Duren on the court, you're going to run into less. Just go back and watch some of those minutes where it feels like. Even with Bagley, you quote unquote want Bagley to be a floor spacer. Like defenses were respecting respect him even less than Isaiah Stewart, much less. And it felt like every time if Beef Stewart had to put the had to put the ball on the floor, he was kind of running into Marvin Bagley. The way that Jalen Duren moves away from the ball and more active as a screen setter, you don't see that as much, even though you wouldn't consider him sort of a floor spacer. And I think at this point where Detroit wants to play two bigs, like that's just something that they're committed to, whether you agree with it, whether you disagree with it, that's just something that they want to try moving forward. Beef Stew and Jalen Duren make all the sense in the world. And it's not, oh, well, we have time to get them. No, do it now, especially with Cade out. Like I would have liked to have seen it with Cade, but do it now because like that's the future way that your front court could function. And I know that it might be tempting to bench one of them in favor of going a little bit smaller. If you want to put Sadiq Bey, where, I've just, the amount of times I flip-flopped on my impressions of him as a player, like where I might now trust him on the ball inside the arc more than I'm going to trust his 3-point shooting, sub 30% or something since Cade went down. And that's why I'm looking at all these numbers since Cade went down, because that's the version of the Pistons that we're going to see. I have hope for them, though, more defensively as a rebounding team when you have Duren and Stewart on the court together. And like I said, the fact that Stewart is just more dynamic as an offensive player now, in addition to the defensive energy that he brings, I think that winds up helping out the team a crap ton. And you need to sort of up your decision-making if you're going to go to minutes where you're trusting Jaden Ivey so much to go through the motions right now. And I think Killian Hayes, by the way, he's going to help there too. Just a smart passer. Even if you don't want to go as far as calling him a high IQ passer, he's certainly a smart passer. What's going to be interesting about this team is whether they keep Bojan Bogdanovic. He's already in trade rumors, been linked to the Lakers. I think he's been linked to the Suns at all. He might have been linked to them as well. He makes sense for so many teams. His shooting has been by and large immaculate. There was a little bit of a dip after the Cade injury initially, but he's brought that back up. And the other thing is just like, he's now without Cade averaging 8 drives a game. And so this is very much someone who is doing more than just shooting. And like the efficiency on these drives from him, no, there's a one-dimensionality to them where it's like you don't trust Jaylen Brown to necessarily facilitate for others out of drives. Bojan's kind of the same way, but among everyone who's taken at least 50 shots out of drives since the Cade Cunningham injury, Bojan Bogdanovic ranks 5th in field goal percentage at 63.1% on drives. Here's everyone. Again, minimum 50 field goal attempts. And the field isn't small. It's about 60 players. Here's everyone with a minimum of 50 field goal attempts off drives since Cade's injury, shooting better than Bojan Bogdanovic. Luka Doncic, Jaylen Brown, Joel Embiid, and Kevin Durant, who, by the way, is at 70.1% on those looks for anyone who cares at home. So he's important, Bojan Bogdanovic, I think, to streamlining the development for others. It's not an issue of, he's taking reps away from Livers and let's get Sadiq Bey into the starting lineup. I get maybe the impetus from some people for wanting to see that, but you're bad as it is, and you're playing enough youngsters as it is. Like I said, it's Marvin Bagley seems better suited for the 6-man role, and he's young. I'm not personally, as an analyst, and also if I were the Pistons, I'm not going to be invested in him. And now you have Jalen Duren and Isaiah Stewart, 2 players who, in my opinion, are way bigger factors to your long view inside the starting lineup, playing together more. You have Jaden Ivey, you have Killian Hayes. Like, you're getting the looks, the extensive looks out of your most important long-term players. I talked about this with Jalen Brunson in New York a little bit, and the Knicks are at a different stage in their development. They just want to be in the middle. Like in the Pistons, they're angling for something better. There's a way to streamline the development by having good veteran players who technically defy your timeline, but they open up pockets of space for everyone, or they put pressure on defenses, or they just give you a baseline level of competence on the offensive end or trustworthiness on the offensive end. So I don't think it's a given that they move him. If the best offer out there is like, you can get Phoenix's pick, or there's a Miami deal with Duncan Robinson and you can get their pick. I mean, I might, if the Heat loosely protect it, they seem pretty combustible, so I'd consider it. But if it's an issue of getting one lower end first round pick in this year's draft and maybe an expiring contract, maybe they don't move Bojan Bogdanovic. There might not be a ton of value there. Let him put up numbers this year. You're still going to lose games. You're still going to get plenty of looks at the kids. So I think the offer needs to blow them away. Even if I propose trades, what I think they should do, I'd take on Duncan Robinson's contract if it meant getting 2 firsts or the equivalent from Miami, or if it's a 3-team trade like that. And I did build some of those hypothetical ones. Maybe we'll talk about them on this podcast one day. So that's the thing I'm watching the most. There was a misconception among people that Bojan Bogdanovic can't be traded after signing his extension. That is not true because of the way that the extension, relative to what he was making right now, ended up panning out. So he can be moved. That doesn't mean that he will be moved. I do think there's a higher likelihood he's moved now, just because there are so few full-on sellers, and even just some of the bad teams looking at in Orlando? Like, who are they? No one's going to be chomping at the bit to get a Terrence Ross right now or a Gary Harris. They're not going to sell. If they trade Wendell Carter Jr. injured right now or someone. A lot of these teams are so young, or they just have limited options that are going to appeal to buyers. So yeah, like Houston has Eric Gordon and Kenyon Martin Jr. But like, who are they moving beyond that? And Charlotte, like like I guess if Cody Martin's healthy, Kelly Oubre Jr. on an expiring contract, PJ Washington, if you want to get a look at him ahead of restricted free agency, there are just so few surefire sellers and so few sellers who actually have these players that can really add value to playoff rotations, who might be a part of certain crunch time lineups in these high leverage games. I do think it makes it more likely Detroit trades Bojan Bogdanovic because they might get more value than we're expecting. They're also working off the opportunity cost of, it cost Kelly Olynyk in seconds to get him. We're able to build off that value just by him playing and signing him to an extension and waiting out the market. So if I had to guess, I might say he'd be traded, but I don't really think it's like this necessity for them, just because he has been so good for them offensively. And now without Cade, I think having that, and I think Bojan Bogdanovic helped Cade because it gave him a little bit more space to operate when he was going inside the arc. I think you want that for Killian Hayes, and I think you want that for Jaden Ivey. I think you even want it for Isaiah Stewart if you're going to ask him to make, pump fake and dribble inside the arc and like to attack the hoop or to put defenses in rotation and trust him to hit a guy for a pass. I think we've even seen Jaden Ivey might be more likely to move off the ball, off the dribble penetration from a Bojan Bogdanovic or an Isaiah Stewart, like once the defenses are sort of moving around. So I'm still very interested to watch this team. It's just a big bummer without Cade. I don't think this really fucks up their long-term future at any point. I think right now, if anything, you can make the case it's a little bit better because now they're ensured that they're not going to play their way out of tippy top lottery odds, even though they might have still been there to begin with. And you will get more information, again, independent of Cade, but of all these other players. And Cade is not someone who's going to come in and disrupt any progress you get from anyone. Killian Hayes, Isaiah Stewart specifically. If Saddiq Bey being on the ball a ton is something that really ends up intriguing you or working, maybe there's some overlap there. But there's nothing about this team you could learn and then look at the way that Cade plays and think, oh, well, yeah, he really can't fit into it. And I know that the jury's still out on a lot of what Cade is going to become, but he's, to me, just a really high level, high IQ, cerebral, ultra versatile, scalable player that is going to be a megastar in this league. I still firmly believe that. And again, it's more valuable to have him on the court right now and still get these reps in. But the Pistons aren't going to go through this depth of self-discovery that they weren't necessarily going to try and plumb if he were still here. And I do think that can at least be something to look towards as we move forward. And I think without Cade on the court, like if you're not worried about maybe optimizing his role, maybe it makes you more inclined to be like, all right, well, we don't have a lot of we don't have extra first round picks in the chamber. We can move Bojan Bogdanovic for this. And maybe it's for not this draft from a really good team, but it's a draft that projects outward, so where the pick could be worth a little bit more. That'll do it for the Cade Cunningham segment, though. It sucks. Hopefully he makes a full recovery. I think he will. I'm not really worried. This Pistons team still should be watchable for me, and I think they've at least made the right adjustments that we maybe didn't expect Dwayne Casey to go to until later in the season. I know Laz and Ben from the Detroit Bad Boys podcast, they were talking about recently how they were kind of floored that Dwayne Casey went to this change. And I had been talking to Laz about would he ever, how long would it take for Dwayne Casey to get to this point when we did our look ahead, way at the beginning of the season. I think there's been some more flexibility here with the way that the Pistons have gotten a look at players that necessarily wouldn't be Casey's first choice. And if I think there's a downside to this, well, there's a downside to this. I want to see more of Cade and Jaden together, but there's a player that I think probably gets hurt the most by Cade being out. It might be sort of a Marvin Bagley. I think Cade was probably important to making what Bagley does best work out. The fact that he's coming off the bench now should maybe let him explore his floor game a little bit more and ensure that he's not going to be occupying the same space as the other front court player that he'll be playing with as often, or at least give him more agency where he's not going to be the second option in the front court among that, or need to even be someone who is the top front court option when you're just looking at the 4-5. So I think that's going to be a better fit for him, but he could be someone who ends up being a little bit hurt or a lot of it hurt his value this season with Cade out. Still, the Pistons, they're in the Wembanyama sweepstakes. That was true beforehand. Still interested in this team, though, as I repeat myself. That'll do it for this for real, though. Please remember to subscribe to us on YouTube, especially if you watched or listened this long. If this is your first time checking us out on the actual audio podcast, subscribe. Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, wherever you get your podcast, we are there. Leave reviews and ratings on Apple and Spotify if you can, even if you don't use them. That helps us out a ton. That's the best way to help out the show, and telling people about us, helping us grow the community. And if you tag us on Twitter, if you comment on YouTube, I do try to respond. And the tags on Twitter or just the recommendations. Like I've had people DM me and say that they've, heard about this podcast via word of mouth and they decided to start listening to it and kept listening to it. So all of that means a lot. Until next time. And as always, I leave you all with the shout out to the one, the only, the indelible Frank Ntilikina.